This is the LinnDrum from 1982, arguably the most famous digital drum machine of all time. It was the successor to the groundbreaking Linn LM1 drum computer from 1979, which was the first commercially available programmable drum machine with sounds generated from digital samples rather than analog synthesis. The LM1 sold around 500 units at $5,000 a pop, and this allowed Roger Linn to develop a second instrument, which was the LinnDrum. Why was it not called the LM2? Well, that moniker was derived from the initials of Roger Linn and Alex Moffat, who was the co-founder and director of what was originally called Linn Moffat Electronics, later just Linn Electronics. Alex left the company in 1982, and so there was no longer an M to Roger's L, hence it was just called the LinnDrum. It's then somewhat ironic that people called it the LM2 anyway, but the name is nowhere to be found on the unit or in any documentation. The LinnDrum has 15 sounds, and I'm going to have to review them with my face, aren't I? Okay. Unlike the earlier LM1, the LinnDrum only has tuning for the snare and side stick, toms and congas, as well as a hi-hat decay. As I've discussed in other videos, with the low sample rates and bit depths of the era, as you tune down, the Nyquist frequency drifts ever deeper into the audible range, and so the aliasing and artifacts that in parts give the sound a crunchy quality that we've come to love. To change sounds, you have to open the unit up, take out the EEPROM or EEPROMs in question, and put in replacements. A separate industry cropped up around this at the time, selling musicians and producers alternative sounds like dog bark. Why was that a thing? Anyway, you can see that the memory available back then was so small that longer samples like the crash and ride cymbals had to be spread across multiple EEPROMs. Despite the restrictions of the technology of the time, engineers like Linn proved the old saying, limitation breeds creativity, and really eked everything out of what they had. For example, the closed hi-hat on the original LM1 is created by the machine constantly taking a different segment of a continuously running open hi-hat sample and applying an envelope to it, meaning that it's slightly different every time, like round robins but from one sample. This can be heard in action on the original demo flexi disc, which I coincidentally have a copy of. Surprisingly, the LinnDrum doesn't include this feature, and I'd be interested to know why. Programming is based around a paradigm that we completely take for granted now, as it's been everywhere for decades, but the Linn machines were the first to introduce it. You set your error correct, now known as quantize, and tap away against the click. Alternatively, there is a step mode if you're not too hot on finger drumming. One of the features that characterise the LinnDrum is the ability to alter the timing in degrees from straight to shuffle. This is where the feel of the LinnDrum comes into play that you may hear people talk about. If you didn't like what you'd done, you can erase it in a second, and if you did, you can store it on the unit, or you could back it up to cassette. You can of course change the lengths of patterns, alter the time signatures and chain patterns together in song mode. This was a total revolution as it allowed non-drummers to program and refine the parts and then take the unit into the studio to lay it down. The LinnDrum was released before MIDI but has a fair amount of connectivity. There are 5 trigger inputs that can be assigned to any of the voices so that the LinnDrum can be played with pads or fired off from external audio. The original manual suggests that this can be used to replace a poorly recorded snare drum, for example, whereby the recording can be used to trigger the LinnDrum snare. Drum replacement has been a staple of music production for years now, but these were the very early days of this technique. There is also a programmable trigger output for hooking the LinnDrum up with sequencers and synths, and 2 CV inputs to modulate the snare/side stick and tom/conga pitches. The manual suggests using a CV pedal for this, but you can use a sequencer. Let's hook it up with a modular synth and see what happens. And sure enough, it works. To be honest, I've used LinnDrums several times and I didn't even know you could do that, so every day's a school day. There's also old style sync in and out, a stereo output with panning, and individual outs for all of the sounds, which shows you that it was a serious bit of studio kit. The joy of this nowadays, of course, is that you can mangle the sounds individually. The LinnDrum was a huge success in the 80s and around 5,000 units were sold at $3,000 each, which is about $8,500 in today's money. It was used by pretty much everyone in the industry at some point during the decade, with Prince of course being one of the most famous users of both the LM1 and the LinnDrum, as he made it an integral part of his sound at the time. The ultimate 80s thing to do was to hit the LinnDrum into a gated reverb, which sounds like this. A familiar story unfolded, which was that as Linn Electronics went out of business with Roger moving on to the also very famous Akai MPC series, the LinnDrum fell out of fashion and was picked up cheaply secondhand by the next generation of musicians who used it in a different way. One such example is Daft Punk, who rocked a LinnDrum in the mid-90s. As things have come full circle and vintage hardware fever has set in, an original unit will set you back a lot of money nowadays, and that's likely to keep on climbing. But fear not, because I have sampled every single sound from this one, and the free download is linked in the description. Hats off to Roger Linn, or should that be high hats off to Roger Linn, for creating something that still influences the way we make music. Thank you to the owner of this LinnDrum, and thank you for watching.